No one wanted the banished girl from the manor, until the crown prince claimed her. She was banished from her home, rejected and unwanted. Everyone turned their backs, believing she'd never rise again. But fate had other plans, because the crown prince himself claimed her as his own. Before we begin, let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The great hall of Ashworth Manor had never felt so big, so cold, so cruel. Alara stood in the middle like someone waiting for punishment, her head held high even though her heart was beating fast. The autumn light coming through the tall windows made everything look gold, and she wondered if she would remember this moment, this last moment of being home, for the rest of her life. Lord Edmund Ashworth, her father, stood behind the wooden table that had been in his family for years. His face looked like it was carved from stone, all hard lines and bitter disappointment. Next to him, her stepmother Eleanor looked pleased, a small smile on her lips. She had been whispering lies about Alara for months. "Lady Alara Ashworth," her father's voice filled the hall, cold and formal. "You are accused of bringing shame to this house, of going against your father's wishes, and of acting in ways that no noble daughter should." The servants stood along the walls like watching birds, their faces pretending to be sad while hiding their excitement. How many times had they served her food, bowed to her in the hallways, accepted her kindness? Now they watched her fall with the same eager attention they gave to street shows and market day fun. "The proof is clear," Edmund went on, his voice getting stronger with each word. "You refused to marry Lord Garrett, saying he was a bad man when his money was exactly what we needed. You stopped me from punishing servants who needed discipline. You spent time with the wrong people, filling your head with dangerous ideas about fairness and kindness that don't belong in a woman's mind." Alara's hands shook at her sides, but she kept her voice steady. "Lord Garrett hurts his servants and his horses. I won't marry a man who enjoys causing pain." "You will not," Eleanor spoke for the first time, her voice soft but cutting. "Because no decent man would have you now. The whole county knows of your willful nature, your barren prospects, your cursed ways. You have made yourself unmarriageable." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Barren. The cruelest accusation a woman could face, though no doctor had ever examined her, though no husband had ever tested the claim. It was suspicion turned to fact through repetition, whispers that had grown into accepted truth. "Therefore," Edmund's voice cut through her shock, "I strip you of your title, your inheritance, and your place in this family. You are no longer my daughter. You are no longer welcome in this house. Guards will see you to the gates with what few belongings charity allows." The hall spun around her. She had expected anger, punishment, perhaps being locked in her room, but this, complete exile, the cutting of all ties that bound her to home, family, protection. "Father, please, I am no longer your father." His voice held no warmth, no regret, nothing but cold dismissal. "And you are no longer my concern." Two guards stepped forward, not roughly but with firm purpose. They had known her since childhood, had sometimes slipped her extra sweets from the kitchen, or helped her climb trees her teachers said were too dangerous for ladies. Now they looked through her as if she were already gone. The walk to her room felt endless. Her feet moved without her mind's direction, carrying her through hallways that had been home for 20 years but would never welcome her again. The guards waited outside while she filled a single cloth bag with what little she could carry: a spare dress, her mother's brush, a small purse with the few coins she kept for giving to beggars. She left behind jewels that had been her mother's, books that had taught her to dream beyond these walls, letters from friends who would now cross the street to avoid her. The room that had sheltered her dreams and fears would house someone else by nightfall. The stable boy brought her horse with downcast eyes. Midnight had been her companion for 5 years, a gentle mare with knowing eyes who had carried her through countryside adventures and quiet morning rides. At least they would face whatever came together. The iron gates of Ashworth Manor had always been a comfort, marking the boundary between home and the dangerous world beyond. Now they opened like jaws to swallow her whole, then clanged shut with terrible finality. She didn't look back. Looking back would break something inside her that she needed to keep whole. Rain began to fall as her horse's hooves echoed on the cobblestones, each step taking her further from everything she had ever known. The servants watched from windows until she disappeared around the bend, then returned to their work with new gossip to share over supper. Behind her, Ashworth Manor glowed warm in the gathering dusk, its windows like eyes that no longer saw her. Ahead lay only darkness and the growing storm, but she pressed forward because stopping meant admitting defeat. She was Lady Alara Ashworth no longer, but she was still alive, still breathing, still capable of making choices even if all her choices were bad ones. The girl who had once planned grand dinners and hosted noble guests was now just another exile on a muddy road, but something flickered in her chest that even banishment couldn't kill. She would survive this. She would find a way. She had to. The village of Millbrook had always been a friendly place when Alara rode through as the manor lord's daughter. Children would wave from doorways, merchants would bow and offer their finest goods, and the inn's owner would always have a smile and fresh bread for the young lady from the big house. Now, with rain soaking through her cloak and mud splashing up from the road, she barely recognized the same place. Or perhaps it was she who had changed beyond recognition. She guided Midnight toward the baker's shop first, remembering how Master Willem had always saved her a sweet roll when she visited the village. Surely he would help her, at least for tonight. But when she pushed open the door, the warm smell of bread couldn't hide the sudden chill that filled the room. Master Willem looked up from his counter, flour dusting his apron, and his face went through several emotions before settling on something like fear. "Lady," he began, then stopped himself. "Miss, what can I do for you?" The title she had worn all her life was already gone, disappeared like morning mist. She was no longer lady to anyone. "I need shelter for the night," she said simply. "I can pay." He glanced toward the back room where his wife was probably listening to every word. "I'm sorry, miss. We've no room here. You might try the inn." But his eyes said what his words didn't. "You're trouble now. You're the girl who was thrown out of her own home. We can't risk helping you." The inn was worse. Master Garrett, not related to the cruel lord she'd refused to marry, but sharing the name that now made her stomach turn, barely looked up from his ledger. "No rooms available," he said without checking his book. "I can see empty windows upstairs." "Reserved," he said firmly. "Try somewhere else." But there was nowhere else. The village had only one inn, and everyone knew it. She stood in the common room, dripping rainwater on floors she would have been welcome to just yesterday, and felt the stares of other travelers. They looked at her with curiosity and something else, the careful distance people kept from those marked by misfortune. She tried 3 more shops, asking not for charity but offering to pay for services. Each door closed a little faster than the last. Word was spreading through the village like fire through dry grass. The Ashworth girl was here, the one who brought shame to her family, the one who must have done something terrible to be cast out like this. By evening, she found herself in the one place that couldn't turn her away, the village church. Father Marcus was a kind man who had blessed her on holy days and spoken gently about charity and Christian mercy in his sermons. Surely he would help. But even the priest hurried past her when she called his name, his robes flapping as he disappeared into the rectory with a quick mumble about evening prayers. The church door was open, but when she tried to sleep in the back pew, a church warden appeared within minutes to explain that the building must be locked at night. She huddled under the church's covered entrance, listening to rain hit the stones and watching the village settle into warm, comfortable evening routines. Lights glowed in windows, families gathered around dinner tables, children were tucked into beds in rooms that smelled like home and safety. Through the baker's window, she could see Master Willem talking urgently with his wife, both of them glancing toward the church. Making sure the dangerous girl wasn't coming back, probably. Planning what they would tell the other villagers tomorrow about how they had protected themselves from contamination. The worst part wasn't the hunger gnawing at her stomach or the cold seeping through her wet cloak. It was the understanding that her exile was complete. These people had known her for years, had taken her family's money and protection, had smiled and bowed and called her my lady just yesterday. But fear was stronger than gratitude, and survival meant not helping those marked for destruction. She wrapped her arms around her knees and tried to make herself small against the stone wall. Midnight stood nearby, sheltered under a tree, equally unwelcome, but at least not alone. Tomorrow she would have to leave this place too, find somewhere that didn't know her story yet. But the rain showed no sign of stopping, and she was learning the first hard lesson of exile. In a world where reputation was everything, losing yours meant losing everything else too. The girl who had once worried about which dress to wear to dinner was now grateful for a few hours of dry stone above her head. 3 days later, Alara found herself in the capital city's poorest district, where the unwanted gathered like leaves blown into corners. Her fine dress was now torn and dirty, her riding boots worn through at the soles, and her small purse of coins had bought her barely enough food to keep breathing. The city was different from the village. Here, being an outcast didn't make you special. It made you normal. Street children with hollow eyes and women in patched clothes moved through narrow alleys with the careful efficiency of people who had learned to survive on scraps. No one stared at her because everyone here had their own troubles. It was in a burned-out building that she met Marta. The older woman was mending a shirt by the light of a small fire, her needle flashing as she worked to repair what others had thrown away. She looked up when Alara stumbled through the doorway, took in the girl's noble features and ruined clothes, and made a sound that might have been laughter. "Let me guess," Marta said, not unkindly. "Family threw you out. Now you're discovering what the rest of us have always known. The world doesn't care what you used to be." Alara sank down near the fire, grateful for warmth even though the smoke stung her eyes. "Is it that obvious? The way you hold yourself. The way you look around like you can't believe this is real." Marta finished her stitching and held up the shirt to examine her work. "I was a seamstress once. Had my own shop, regular customers, a nice room above the store. Then I made the mistake of having a baby without a husband. Lost everything in a week. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm tougher now than I ever was in my nice room with my nice customers." Marta studied Alara with sharp eyes. "Question is, are you tough enough to survive this, or are you going to curl up and die like a flower pulled from its garden?" It was a fair question. Alara looked around the ruined building where maybe a dozen people had made their camp. She saw children who should have been in schools learning letters, women who should have been running households, men who should have been working trades, all of them cast aside for reasons that probably made sense to someone somewhere. "I can read and write," she said finally. "I know healing herbs. I can organize things. Then you might make it." Marta handed her a bowl of thin soup that tasted like heaven, despite being mostly water and scraps. "But you need to learn the rules fast. First rule, we take care of each other because no one else will. Second rule, we stay invisible to those who might cause trouble. Third rule, we never ever beg from those who threw us away. We have pride even if we don't have anything else." Over the following weeks, Alara learned those rules and more. She learned that a fire built in a certain way would give more heat with less smoke. She learned which shop owners might have day-old bread to spare and which ones would set the constables on beggars. She learned that women alone were safer in groups, and that even among the desperate, there were those who would prey on weakness. But she also learned things that surprised her. She learned that poor people were often more generous than rich ones, sharing their last crust with someone hungrier. She learned that without titles and property to fight over, people could be judged by their actions alone. She learned that the skills her teachers had taught her, reading, writing, basic healing, organizing, were precious gifts in a world where most had never had the chance to learn them. Soon she was reading letters for those who couldn't, writing messages for people trying to contact distant family, teaching children their numbers using stones and sticks. When someone fell sick, they came to her for the herb knowledge her mother had passed down. When arguments broke out, people asked her to settle disputes because she could see all sides fairly. The winter was harsh, and more than once she thought she might not survive it. Her hands cracked and bled from the cold, her stomach cramped from hunger. She learned to sleep on stone and wake grateful for each dawn that found her still breathing. But something unexpected happened in that ruined building among the forgotten people. She began to understand her own strength. The girl who had been told she was worthless discovered she had skills that mattered. The daughter who had been called willful learned that her stubbornness was actually courage. The woman labeled barren found herself nurturing a community of cast-offs who had become her chosen family. She still looked toward the castle walls visible in the distance and wondered about the life that could have been. But increasingly, she looked around at the faces lit by firelight and felt something she had never experienced in her father's house, the deep satisfaction of being truly needed, truly valued for who she was rather than what she represented. When spring came and the worst of the winter was over, Alara realized she was no longer the same person who had been thrown out of Ashworth Manor. That girl had been soft, untested, dependent on others for everything from food to safety to purpose. This woman was lean and hard and capable of things that would have terrified her former self. She still dreamed sometimes of warm beds and full meals, of books and clean clothes and the luxury of privacy. But she also dreamed now of justice for people like Marta, of schools for the street children, of a world where being cast out didn't mean being forgotten. She had learned to survive. Now she was beginning to learn to hope. Prince Adrian had a habit that worried his guards and frustrated his advisors. He insisted on riding through the city's poorest districts during his evening wanderings. Not the tours that visiting nobles took, with carefully planned routes and prepared speeches, but real exploration of places where royalty was never expected and rarely welcome. His captain always protested, "It's not safe, Your Highness. These people have nothing to lose and everything to gain from harming you." But Adrian had learned more about his future kingdom in these unguarded moments than from all the reports and meetings that filled his official days. He saw how people lived when they thought no prince was watching. He listened to conversations that revealed the true state of things beyond palace walls. Tonight, something made him slow his horse near a burned-out building where firelight flickered through broken windows. Voices drifted out, not angry or desperate, but organized, purposeful. Curious, he dismounted and moved close enough to see inside without being seen. A young woman sat in the center of a circle of children, using charcoal and a flat stone to teach them letters. Her dress was patched and worn, her hair braided simply back, but she held herself with a bearing that spoke of something beyond poverty. When she spoke, her voice carried natural authority. "The letter A looks like a tent," she was saying, drawing the shape carefully. "Can you remember that? And B looks like it has 2 rooms, one on top of the other." A small boy with thin arms raised his hand. "What about my name?" "How do you write Tom?" She smiled, and Adrian felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't a practice smile like those he saw at court functions, but something real and warm that transformed her entire face. "Let's work on that. T is easy. It looks like a cross. Then O is a circle, like the sun. And M looks like mountains." An older woman approached the teaching circle with news about a sick child in another building. The young teacher, Adrian found himself thinking of her that way, immediately began gathering herbs from a small pouch, explaining their uses as she worked. "Willow bark for the fever, chamomile for sleep, honey if we can find any to make the medicine taste better." Her hands moved with practiced confidence. "I'll come with you. The little ones here can practice their letters while I'm gone." Adrian watched her leave the warm circle without hesitation, stepping into the cold night to help someone in need. When she returned an hour later, she resumed the lesson as if nothing had happened, though he noticed she was shivering now and her feet were wet from puddles. Something about her steadiness drew him back night after night. He began timing his rides to pass the building when her makeshift school was in session. He saw her settle disputes between adults with wisdom that would have impressed his own counselors. He watched her organize the small community with gentle efficiency, never giving orders but somehow inspiring cooperation. She shared her own meager meals with those who had less. When winter storms threatened their shelter, she was the one who figured out how to block the worst gaps in the walls. When despair threatened to overwhelm someone, she found words of comfort that weren't empty promises, but practical hope. Most of all, he saw how she carried herself. Despite the patched clothes and rough conditions, despite sleeping on stone and eating scraps, she moved like nobility. Not the kind learned at court functions, but something deeper, an inner dignity that poverty couldn't touch. His captain finally noticed the pattern of their evening routes. "You're watching someone, aren't you, Your Highness?" Adrian considered lying, then decided on partial truth. There's a woman there. She's interesting. A commoner? The captain's voice held disapproval. Your Highness, surely there are more suitable. Suitable. The word tasted bitter in Adrian's mouth. He thought of the court ladies he was expected to notice, with their calculated smiles and practiced conversation, women who saw him as a crown to be won rather than a man to be known. Tell me, Captain, what makes someone suitable? Birth, breeding, proper family connections. And what if those things produced cruelty? What if someone with all the right connections was actually wrong in all the ways that mattered? The captain said nothing, but Adrian could feel his confusion. Princes were supposed to value bloodlines and dowries, not the ability to teach children or comfort the sick. But Adrian had been raised by a father who spoke often of duty to all subjects, not just noble ones. He had seen too much of court life to believe that fine breeding guaranteed good character. And he had spent too many evenings watching this mysterious woman to dismiss what he saw as anything less than the kind of leadership his kingdom actually needed. He still didn't know her name, her history, why someone with her obvious quality was living among the city's forgotten, but he knew with growing certainty that she was worth knowing, worth protecting, worth claiming if he could find the courage to try. The next time he rode past the burned building, he promised himself he would find a way to speak with her. What he would say, he didn't know. How a prince approached a woman who had every reason to distrust the powerful, he couldn't imagine. But he would try. Because some things, he was learning, were too important to leave to chance or custom or the advice of cautious guards. The royal guard appeared at dawn like a figure from a nightmare, his blue and gold uniform bright as a peacock among the drab browns and grays of the forgotten district. Alara was helping Marta prepare thin porridge for the children when his shadow fell across their small fire. You there, he said, pointing directly at her. You're to come with me, now. The children scattered like startled birds, and Marta instinctively moved closer to Alara's side. In the poor districts, royal guards meant trouble, someone accused of theft or begging too boldly or simply being in the wrong place when someone important wanted to make an example. What for? Alara asked, proud that her voice didn't shake even though her knees were trembling. Prince's orders, you're summoned to appear before His Highness immediately. The words hit her like physical blows, summoned, before the prince. Immediately. Each word carried the weight of absolute power, the kind that could make people disappear without questions asked. Marta grabbed her arm. This is a mistake. She's done nothing wrong. She helps people, teaches the children. I don't question orders, the guard said firmly, but not unkindly. I'm told to bring her, so I bring her. You can come peacefully or make this difficult for everyone. Around them, the other residents of their makeshift community watched with frightened eyes. They all knew the stories of people taken by royal guards who never returned. Alara felt their fear like a weight on her shoulders, adding to her own terror. Let me wash, she said quietly. Please. Just a few minutes to make myself presentable. The guard looked her up and down, taking in her patched dress and worn boots, her hair that hadn't seen a proper mirror in months. Something that might have been pity flickered in his eyes. 5 minutes, but don't try to run. I have orders to bring you back either way. Marta helped her with shaking hands, braiding her hair as neatly as possible, brushing dust from her cleanest dress. It was hopeless, really. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had been living rough, wearing clothes that had seen too much weather and not enough soap. Maybe it's not bad, Marta whispered, though her voice held no conviction. Maybe someone spoke well of you. Maybe he wants to ask about the work you do here. But they both knew better. Princes didn't summon peasant women for friendly conversations. If she had somehow attracted royal attention, it was more likely because someone had accused her of something. Perhaps her father had decided she was embarrassing the family name even in exile. Perhaps someone had reported her for teaching without permission or practicing healing without proper training. The walk to the castle felt endless and too short at the same time. Every step took her further from the community that had become her family and closer to whatever judgment awaited. The guard didn't speak, but he didn't seem cruel either, just a man doing his job, leading her toward a fate neither of them understood. The castle she had visited as a child during grand occasions now loomed like something from a dark fairy tale. The walls seemed too high, the towers too sharp, the gates too heavy. When they opened to admit her, she felt like she was being swallowed whole. Inside, servants bustled through corridors that she remembered, but they looked through her as if she were invisible. A girl in rags wasn't worth noticing, even if she was under royal guard. Their dismissal stung worse than outright cruelty because it was so complete, so automatic. The throne room doors opened like jaws. The vast space beyond seemed designed to make visitors feel small and powerless, with its soaring ceiling and cold stone walls. Banners hung like watching eyes, and her footsteps echoed loudly on the polished marble floor. But the throne was empty. "Wait here," the guard said, positioning himself by the door. "His Highness will arrive shortly." Alara stood in the center of the vast room, trying not to fidget under the painted gazes of long-dead kings. She had been in this room before, years ago, for her father's oath of loyalty to the crown. Then, she had worn silk and jewels, had walked beside other noble daughters in a ceremony full of pageantry and pride. Now she stood alone in patched wool, carrying the smell of wood smoke and worry. The side door opened with barely a whisper, and Prince Adrian entered. He was taller than she had expected, with dark hair and darker eyes that seemed to see everything at once. His clothes were rich but simple, no crown, no elaborate robes, just well-made garments that spoke of wealth without screaming about it. When he moved, it was with the controlled grace of someone trained in both diplomacy and sword work. But what struck her most was his face. She had expected cruelty or coldness, the distant authority of someone born to rule over others. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like uncertainty, as if he wasn't entirely sure why he had summoned her either. "Leave us," he said quietly to the guard, who bowed and withdrew, closing the great doors behind him. Now they were alone in the vast space, prince and peasant woman, with nothing but marble and silence between them. Alara's heart hammered so loudly she was sure he could hear it echoing off the walls. Prince Adrian studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes taking in her appearance without the disgust she expected. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had imagined a prince's voice would be. "Do you know why you're here?" "No, Your Highness." She kept her eyes downcast, as was proper, though every instinct screamed at her to watch his face for signs of danger. "I've been watching you." The words sent ice through her veins. Being watched by royalty was never good news for people like her. "I've done nothing wrong, Your Highness. I help people, teach children their letters, tend the sick with herbs. Nothing illegal, nothing harmful." "I know." His voice stopped her panicked explanations. "I've seen what you do, how you organize your community, how you settle disputes, how you share what little you have. I've seen you teach children with patience that would shame most tutors and tend the sick with skill that rivals court physicians." She risked a glance at his face and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Not anger, not disgust, but something more complex. "I've also learned who you were before," he continued. "Lady Alara Ashworth, daughter of Lord Edmund, cast out of your father's house for refusing an unsuitable marriage and defending your principles." Heat flooded her cheeks. So he knew. He knew she was the girl nobody wanted, the daughter so shameful her own father had disowned her. "If you know that, Your Highness, then you know I'm no one important, no one worth your time." "On the contrary." Prince Adrian stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "I think you might be exactly what this kingdom needs. I have a proposition for you." The words hung in the air between them like something that might either save or destroy her. Alara's heart felt like it might beat right out of her chest as Prince Adrian began to pace before the empty throne, his boots clicking against the marble with each measured step. "You speak of what the kingdom needs," she said carefully, "but I don't understand what that has to do with me, Your Highness." He stopped pacing and turned to face her directly. "The court is full of people who have never known want, never faced real hardship, never had to survive on their own merits. They play games with other people's lives because they have never had to live with the consequences. They measure worth by bloodlines and gold rather than character and capability." His voice carried an anger that surprised her, though it seemed directed at the court rather than at her. I need someone who understands what real leadership means, someone who can see past titles and traditions to what actually matters. I still don't understand. I'm asking you to marry me. The words hit her like a physical blow. For a moment she was sure she had misheard, that stress and fear had finally driven her completely mad. Princes didn't marry peasant women. They especially didn't marry disgraced noblewomen living in ruins with beggars and outcasts. That's impossible, Your Highness. Why? He asked the question as if he genuinely wanted an answer. Because you were cast out by your family? Because you've been living in poverty? Because society has decided you're worthless? Each question felt like an arrow finding its mark. Yes, all of those things. Yes, because she was exactly the kind of woman no respectable man would want, let alone a prince who could have anyone. Because I have nothing to offer you, she said quietly. No dowry, no family connections, no political advantages. I'm the girl nobody wanted, remember? Even my own father threw me away. Prince Adrian moved closer, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. What if I told you that everything you think makes you worthless is exactly what makes you valuable to me? I would say you're either mad or lying, Your Highness. To her amazement, he almost smiled at that. Fair enough. Let me be completely honest with you then. This isn't a love match. I won't pretend to offer you romance or promise feelings I don't have. This is a political alliance, but not the kind the court expects. He began pacing again, his words coming faster as if he'd been thinking about this for a long time. I need a queen who understands the people she'll serve, not just the nobles she'll entertain. I need someone who won't be corrupted by power, because she's already learned to live without it. I need a partner who can help me build a kingdom that serves everyone, not just those born with advantages. And in return? The question came out harder than she intended, but she had learned not to accept gifts without understanding their price. In return, you get protection from a world that has treated you cruelly. You get resources to help the people you care about. You get a voice in how this kingdom is run and the power to make changes you've only dreamed of. It was a tempting picture he painted, but Alara had learned to be suspicious of tempting offers. And if I say no, then you walk out of here as free as you walked in. I won't force this on anyone, and I won't punish you for refusing. She studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden threats. Instead, she saw something that looked like sincerity, though she hardly dared trust it. Why me? She asked finally. If you want someone who understands the common people, there must be others. Women who haven't been marked as outcasts, who wouldn't bring scandal to your name. Because the others haven't been tested the way you have. They might sympathize with the poor, but they've never been poor. They might speak about justice, but they've never had to fight for it. You've survived things that would have broken someone softer, and you've come through it with your compassion intact. That's rare. Or I could be bitter and vengeful. Someone who wants power only to use it against those who hurt me. Are you? The question caught her off guard. Was she? She had certainly felt anger toward her father, her stepmother, the villagers who had turned their backs on her. But when she looked honestly at her heart, she found something else there too. No, she said slowly. I'm angry, yes, but mostly I just want to help people who are hurting the way I was hurt. Then you understand why I'm asking. Alara looked around the throne room, at the symbols of power and wealth that surrounded them. A few months ago, she would have been dazzled by the offer, desperate to accept anything that promised safety and comfort. Now, having learned what it meant to be truly powerless, she understood that this decision was too important to make from fear or desperation. I need time to think, she said. Prince Adrian nodded as if he had expected this. How much time? 3 days? Granted. You may return to your friends while you decide. I'll have food and supplies sent to your district, not as payment for your consideration, but because it's needed regardless of your answer. That gesture meant more to her than any promise of personal luxury could have. He was thinking of the people she cared about, not just trying to win her over. Thank you, Your Highness. Adrian, he said quietly, if you accept this proposition, we'll be partners. Partners should use each other's names. The informality felt strange and dangerous, like stepping onto ice that might not hold her weight. but she nodded. 3 days, Adrian. Walking out of that throne room felt like waking from a dream. The guard who had brought her was waiting to escort her back, his face carefully neutral. As they walked through the castle corridors, Alara tried to process what had just happened. A prince had asked her to marry him. Not for love, he'd been honest about that, but for reasons that made a strange kind of sense, if she could bring herself to believe them. The question was, did she dare say yes to a man who claimed to want her exactly because everyone else had thrown her away? Alara walked through the poor district like someone in a dream, barely seeing the familiar streets and faces. The guard had left her at the edge of the area with a respectful nod, and now she made her way back to the burned building that had become home, her mind spinning with impossible possibilities. Marta was waiting with barely controlled panic, grabbing Alara's hands the moment she appeared. "You're back. You're alive. What did they want? What happened?" The other residents of their small community gathered around, faces tight with worry. In their world, being summoned by royalty usually meant someone wasn't coming back. The fact that she had returned safely was almost as shocking as the summons itself. "I need to sit down," Alara said weakly, sinking onto a wooden crate by their fire. "I need to tell you something, but I'm not sure you'll believe it." "Try us," said old Tom, a former soldier who had lost his leg in the king's service and been discarded when he was no longer useful for fighting. "We've seen plenty of unbelievable things." So Alara told them. About being watched, about the summons, about Prince Adrian's impossible offer. She watched their faces change as she spoke, from worry to disbelief to something that might have been hope, if hope weren't too dangerous a thing for people like them to feel. When she finished, silence stretched between them like a held breath. "A prince wants to marry you," Marta said slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made any sense when spoken aloud. "He says it's political, a practical arrangement." "All royal marriages are political," old Tom pointed out. "The strange part is him choosing someone like you, like us, instead of some duke's daughter with a chest full of gold." "That's what worries me," Alara admitted. "What if this is some kind of game? What if he's planning to humiliate me publicly, or use me somehow and then discard me when it's convenient?" Young Sarah, barely 16 and 6 months pregnant after being thrown out by her family, spoke up from where she sat mending a torn shirt. "What if it's real? What if he actually means what he says? Then I marry a man I don't love who doesn't love me and become part of a world that has already shown me exactly how cruel it can be." "But you'd have power," Marta said quietly. "Real power. The kind that could change things for people like us." That was the heart of it, wasn't it? The reason she couldn't simply refuse and walk away. If Prince Adrian was telling the truth, if he really wanted to build a kingdom that served everyone instead of just the wealthy and titled, then marriage to him could mean hope for all the forgotten people she had come to love. But if he was lying, if this was manipulation or mockery disguised as opportunity, then she would be trading her hard-won independence for a cage made of gold instead of poverty. "I keep thinking about the children," she confessed, "the ones I teach letters to. What if I could help build schools for them? Real schools with real teachers and books and warm rooms. And I keep thinking about the sick people who die because they can't afford medicine," Sarah added softly. "What if a queen could change that? What if she couldn't?" Old Tom's voice held the bitter wisdom of someone who had trusted the powerful before and been betrayed. What if she just gets swallowed up by their world and forgets where she came from? It was a fair fear. Alara had seen how quickly people could change when their circumstances improved, how easy it was to forget suffering once you were no longer experiencing it yourself. "There's another thing," she said slowly. "He gave me 3 days to decide, but he's already having food and supplies sent here, whether I accept or not. The implications of that sank in slowly. A prince who would help their community without expecting anything in return was unusual. It suggested that his concern for the poor might be genuine rather than calculated." "That's either very good or very dangerous," Marta observed. "Good if he means it. Dangerous if he's trying to show you what you'd be giving up by refusing." They talked through the night, weighing possibilities and fears like merchants calculating the worth of precious goods. By dawn, Alara was no closer to a decision, but she understood the choice more clearly. She could stay safe in her small world, continue helping people on a small scale, and never risk being hurt again by trusting someone with power over her. Or she could take an enormous gamble on a man who claimed to want exactly what made her unmarriageable to everyone else. The second day brought the promised supplies, wagons full of food, blankets, medicine, and other necessities that the poor district hadn't seen in years. The royal guards who delivered them were respectful, efficient, and notably free of the contempt usually shown to the city's outcasts. "He's serious about this," Marta observed, watching the guards distribute supplies without looking disgusted by their surroundings. "Whatever his reasons, he's putting real resources behind his words." That night, Alara climbed to the roof of their ruined building and looked out over the city. In the distance, the castle glowed with warm light, its windows like eyes watching over the kingdom. Closer by, she could see the poor districts where people huddled around small fires, making do with little and hoping for less. If she married Prince Adrian, she would join that distant light. But would she still be able to see these closer fires? Would she remember what it felt like to be cold and hungry and forgotten? On the third morning, she knew her answer. It came not from careful reasoning, but from a simple truth. She had survived the worst that life could throw at her, and she had not only endured, but found ways to help others endure too. If Prince Adrian was offering her a chance to do that on a larger scale, how could she refuse out of fear? And if he was lying, if this was all some elaborate trap or cruel joke, well, she had survived exile and poverty and rejection. She could survive betrayal too, if necessary. But perhaps, just perhaps, she wouldn't have to. This time, Alara walked through the castle corridors with her head held high. She wore the same patched dress, carried the same uncertainty in her heart, but something fundamental had changed in those 3 days of consideration. She was no longer a desperate woman grateful for any escape, but someone making a calculated choice about her future. Prince Adrian was waiting in a smaller chamber this time, not the intimidating throne room, but a study lined with books and maps. He looked up when she entered, and she saw something that might have been relief flicker across his features. "You came back. I said I would." Many people say things they don't mean. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Please, sit. Have you reached a decision?" "I have. But first, I have conditions." His eyebrows rose slightly, and for a moment she wondered if she had overstepped. Peasant women didn't usually dictate terms to princes. But then something that looked like approval crossed his face. "I'm listening." Alara took a breath, drawing on the courage she had learned in dark alleys and cold nights. "First, I won't be a decorative wife locked away in a tower. If you want my help building a better kingdom, then I need to be involved in the actual work, not just smile and wave at celebrations." "Agreed." "Second, I want to continue helping the people I've been working with. The poor districts, the forgotten communities. I won't abandon them just because my circumstances have changed." "Also agreed." His quick acceptance surprised her. She had expected negotiation, maybe resistance. "Third, I want honesty between us. No pretty lies about love or romance, but also no hidden agendas or secret purposes. If this marriage serves your political needs, I need to understand what those needs are." Prince Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying her with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than most people showed. "Those are reasonable terms. Do you have others?" "One more? I want it in writing, all of it. My rights, my responsibilities, my protections. I've learned not to trust in verbal promises alone." Now he did smile, and it transformed his whole face. "You negotiate like someone who has everything to lose." "Because I do." She met his gaze steadily. "I've built a life in those poor districts. It's not much by your standards, but it's mine. I'm risking all of that on the hope that you're different from other powerful men I've known. And if I prove you wrong, then I'll survive it. I've survived worse." Something in her voice must have convinced him of her sincerity, because he pulled out a document from his desk drawer. "I had this prepared while you were considering my offer. I hope you'll find it acceptable." Alara took the marriage contract with hands that only trembled slightly. As she read, her eyes widened. This wasn't like any marriage agreement she had ever heard of. The document granted her an independent income, the right to maintain her own household staff, freedom to travel and pursue her charitable work without requiring permission. It established her as an equal partner in decisions affecting the kingdom's social policies, gave her a voice in matters of justice and mercy. Most surprisingly, it included provisions for the people she cared about, resources for schools in poor districts, funding for medicine and supplies, protections for those who might be targeted for their association with the new queen. This is generous beyond what I expected. I told you this would be a partnership. Partners need to be able to act independently while working toward common goals. She reached the final pages and stopped, staring at a clause that made her heart skip. What is this section about? Protection, he said simply. If our marriage fails, if you decide you can't stay, if I prove unworthy of your trust, you'll be provided for. House, income, safety. You'll never have to live in poverty again, regardless of what happens between us. It was more than generous. It was revolutionary. Marriage contracts were supposed to bind women to their husband's will, not provide them with escape routes. Why would you give me such freedom to leave? Because a partnership based on fear isn't a partnership at all. If you stay, I want it to be because you choose to, not because you have no other option. Alara set the document down carefully, her mind reeling. This man, this prince, was offering her something she had never dared dream of. True choice, ongoing choice, the power to shape her own destiny even within marriage. There's one thing not covered in here, she said slowly. What's that? What you get out of this arrangement. You've been very clear about what you're offering me, but not about what you need from me in return. Prince Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled before his lips. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she had heard it before. I need someone who can help me remember what we're supposed to be serving. Someone who has experienced the worst of what our kingdom allows and still believes it can be better. I need a queen who can look at suffering and see solutions instead of inconveniences. And personally, what do you need from me as a wife? Honestly, I don't know yet. I've never had a wife before, never had a true partner in anything that mattered. I suppose we'll have to figure that out as we go. His vulnerability in that admission touched something in her chest. Here was a man with all the power in the world, admitting he didn't know how to use it properly, asking for help from someone society had discarded. All right, she said quietly. Yes, I accept your offer, Prince Adrian. Adrian, he corrected gently. Just Adrian, when we're alone like this. Adrian. The name felt strange on her tongue, too informal, too intimate for what was still essentially a business arrangement. But she suspected she would get used to it. Then we have an agreement. He stood and moved around the desk, extending his hand to her. Partners? She took his hand, noting that his grip was firm but careful, strong but not dominating. Partners. As their hands clasped, Alara felt as if she were stepping off a cliff into empty air. She had no idea where she would land, but for the first time in months she was no longer falling. She was choosing to jump. The announcement of Prince Adrian's engagement to the former Lady Alara Ashworth spread through the kingdom like wildfire, leaving scandal and confusion in its wake. In taverns and marketplaces, people whispered about the prince who had chosen the girl nobody wanted. In manor houses and noble courts, the reaction was less wonder than horror. Alara learned about the kingdom's response secondhand, as she was immediately swept into the intensive process of preparing a peasant woman to become a princess. Royal seamstresses descended upon her with measuring tapes and disapproving looks, transforming her worn dresses into rich gowns that felt like costumes on her unfamiliar body. "Hold still," muttered the head seamstress around a mouthful of pins. "Your posture needs work. A princess doesn't slouch." But Alara's body had learned different lessons over the past months: how to make herself small when danger threatened, how to move quietly through crowds, how to conserve energy for long days of work. Learning to fill space again instead of avoiding it felt like learning to speak a foreign language. The royal chambers assigned to her were larger than the entire burned building where she had lived with her makeshift family. The bed alone could have slept 6 people comfortably, and the sitting room held more furniture than most poor families saw in a lifetime. She wandered through the rooms like a lost child, touching silks and velvets that her calloused hands could barely feel anymore. A knock at her door brought her a visitor she wasn't expecting. Lady Margaret, the head of the ladies-in-waiting, a woman whose silver hair and stern expression spoke of decades navigating court politics. "Your Highness," Lady Margaret said, with a curtsy that managed to be technically correct while conveying subtle disapproval, "I've come to discuss your household arrangements. Please call me Alara. I'm not comfortable with titles yet." "That," Lady Margaret said crisply, "is precisely the problem. You will be Princess Alara within the week, and eventually Queen Alara. The court is watching every move you make, every word you speak, every gesture you fail to make properly. They are looking for reasons to dismiss you as unworthy." It was bluntly stated but not unkindly meant. Alara appreciated the directness even as the message made her stomach tighten with anxiety. "What do I need to know?" "Everything." Little Lady Margaret settled into a chair with the air of someone prepared for a long siege. How to walk, how to sit, how to eat in public without looking like you've been starving, how to speak so that you command attention instead of pity, how to dress so that you look like you belong in these clothes instead of wearing a costume. The lessons began immediately and felt overwhelming. There were rules for everything: how to enter a room, how to acknowledge different ranks of nobility, how to hold a fan so that it conveyed the right message. Alara's head spun with protocols that seemed designed more to exclude than to serve any practical purpose. But the worst part wasn't the complexity of court etiquette. It was the isolation. Her friends from the poor district were forbidden from visiting the castle. "Security concerns," the guards explained politely but firmly. The servants assigned to her were efficient but distant, addressing her with titles that felt like walls between them. Even the other noble ladies who were supposed to be her companions seemed to view her as an interesting problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. Adrian visited every evening, formal conversations about wedding preparations and future duties. He was kind but careful, treating her like a valued diplomatic partner rather than someone he was about to marry. She found herself watching his face for signs of regret, wondering if he was beginning to realize he had made a mistake. "You seem troubled," he observed one evening, noting how she picked at her dinner instead of eating it. "Just adjusting," she said carefully. "Everything is very different from what I'm used to." "Different how?" She considered how to explain without sounding ungrateful. "In the poor district, we had nothing, but we had each other. Here I have everything I could possibly need, but I feel like I'm disappearing." Adrian set down his fork and really looked at her for the first time that evening. "Disappearing how?" "Everyone wants to turn me into someone else. Better posture, proper speech, appropriate interests. They're very polite about it, but the message is clear. Who I was before isn't good enough for who I need to become." "And what do you think?" The question surprised her. "What do I think about what?" "About who you need to become." "Do you agree with them?" Alara considered carefully. "I think I need to learn enough about court life to function in it. But I don't want to lose the parts of myself that made you think I was worth marrying in the first place." Something shifted in Adrian's expression, a warmth she hadn't seen before. "Then don't lose them. Learn what you need to learn, but stay who you are underneath. The court will try to remake you into their image of what a princess should be. I'm asking you to help me remake what a princess could be instead." It was the first time since accepting his proposal that Alara felt like she could breathe properly. She wasn't supposed to disappear into the role, she was supposed to change the role itself. That sounds much more difficult than just learning proper etiquette. "Most worthwhile things are difficult." Adrian's smile was small but genuine. "But I think you're strong enough to handle difficult. After all, you've survived everything else life has thrown at you." That night, alone in her vast chamber, Alara stood before the mirror and studied her reflection. The silk gown and carefully arranged hair made her look like a stranger, but underneath the finery, her eyes still held the same determination that had carried her through exile and poverty. She was becoming a princess, yes, but she was still Alara, the woman who had learned to survive, to lead, to care for others when no one cared for her. The challenge now was figuring out how to be both things at once, royal enough to command respect, but real enough to deserve it. The formal presentation of Prince Adrian's bride-to-be to the court was scheduled for a week before the wedding, and Alara spent the days leading up to it feeling like a gladiator preparing for the arena. Lady Margaret drilled her relentlessly on names, titles, family connections, and the subtle social hierarchies that governed every interaction. Lady Vivian is the Duke of Westford's daughter, Margaret explained as they reviewed portraits of the most influential court members. She expected to marry the prince herself, so she'll be particularly attentive to your performance tonight. Lord Hawthorne controls the grain trade and has the ear of several key nobles. Lady Catherine seems sweet, but her smiles hide a sharp tongue. And whatever you do, don't trust anything Lord Blackwood says. He collects secrets like other men collect coins. When the evening arrived, Alara felt reasonably prepared for the political landscape she was about to navigate. What she hadn't prepared for was the sheer weight of their collective judgment. The moment she entered the great hall on Adrian's arm, conversation didn't stop. It sharpened. Every eye in the room turned to assess her, and she could feel their gazes like physical touches, cataloging every detail of her appearance and behavior. "Smile," Adrian murmured quietly, "but not too much. You're a princess, not a merchant trying to make a sale." She followed his lead as they moved through the room, being introduced to an endless stream of lords and ladies whose names blurred together in her nervous mind. Most offered polite congratulations that didn't reach their eyes, but she began to notice patterns in their reactions. The older nobles seemed merely puzzled by Adrian's choice, as if he had selected an unusual piece of art that they couldn't quite understand, but assumed must have some hidden value. The younger courtiers were more actively hostile, their smiles sharp as blade edges. Lady Vivian approached them near the refreshment table, gliding across the marble floor in a gown that probably cost more than most families saw in a year. She was beautiful in the polished way that money and breeding could create. Perfect features, flawless skin, hair that caught the light like spun gold. "Your Highness," she said with a curtsy that was technically perfect, but somehow managed to convey condescension. "How brave of you to take on such charitable responsibilities." "I'm sorry?" Alara wasn't sure she had heard correctly. "Oh, I simply meant that it's so generous of Prince Adrian to rescue you from such unfortunate circumstances. Though I suppose some might say it's the other way around, that you're quite fortunate to have caught his attention during your difficult period." The words were carefully chosen, each one technically polite but loaded with implications. Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks and saw Vivian's satisfied smile at the reaction. "Lady Vivian?" Adrian's voice was quiet but carried an edge of warning. "Perhaps you'd care to elaborate on what you mean by charitable responsibilities?" "Oh, nothing improper, Your Highness. I simply admire your compassion for those less fortunate. It speaks well of your character that you would extend such kindness to someone who has experienced such hardships." It was masterfully done. Every word could be defended as complimentary if challenged, but the overall message was clear. Alara was a charity case, a beggar elevated beyond her proper station by royal pity. "Indeed," Adrian said smoothly. "I find that those who have faced real hardship often understand the true value of compassion better than those who have only read about suffering in books." The subtle rebuke hit its mark. Vivian's smile faltered for just a moment before returning full force. "Of course, Your Highness. How foolish of me not to recognize the educational value of such experiences." As the evening progressed, Alara began to understand that Vivian's approach was the polite version of the court's assessment. Others were less subtle. "Such an interesting choice," she overheard Lord Blackwood murmur to a companion. "One wonders what hold she has over him. Surely desperation makes even the most discerning men flexible in their standards." "Perhaps it's precisely her lack of standards that appeals," came the reply. "After all, a woman who has lived among beggars would be grateful for any attention from a prince, wouldn't she?" Each conversation she caught fragments of cut a little deeper. They spoke about her as if she weren't there, analyzing her background like scholars dissecting a particularly unpleasant specimen. "The family threw her out, you know. Her own father disowned her. Must have been something quite shocking. Decent families don't cast out daughters lightly. I heard she was barren. Cursed bloodline, some say." Well, that would explain the prince's choice. No risk of problematic heirs. By the middle of the evening, Alara felt like she was drowning in silk and malice. Every smile felt like a threat, every compliment like a dagger wrapped in ribbon. She excused herself to the ladies' retiring room, desperate for a moment away from the watching eyes and whispered judgments. But even there, she found no peace. A group of younger ladies were already gathered near the mirrors, and their conversation stopped abruptly when she entered. "Oh, Lady Alara," one of them said with false sweetness, "we were just discussing the upcoming wedding." Such an unusual romance. Unusual how? Alara asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Well, it's just so refreshing to see a love story that's based on practical considerations rather than silly sentiment. So modern of the prince to choose a wife based on her unique qualifications. The emphasis on unique qualifications made it clear they weren't referring to her character or intelligence. Alara felt something snap inside her chest, all her careful preparation and diplomatic training evaporating in the face of their casual cruelty. "You're right," she said quietly. "It is unusual. Most princes marry for political alliances or family connections, choosing wives based on their father's wealth rather than their own worth. How refreshing that Prince Adrian values substance over superficial accomplishments." The ladies exchanged glances, suddenly uncertain. They had expected defensiveness or hurt, not a counterattack that called their own marriages into question. "Of course," Alara continued, her voice growing stronger. "I suppose it's natural for people to judge others by the standards they know best. Those who have only learned to be decorative might struggle to understand the value of being useful." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Then one of the ladies laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "How charming. The street beggar has learned to bite." "Yes," Alara said evenly. "I have. And unlike a decorative dog that only knows tricks, I bite when it matters." She left them standing in stunned silence and returned to the great hall, her head held high despite the trembling in her hands. Adrian appeared at her side almost immediately, as if he had been watching for her return. "You look like you've been in battle," he observed quietly. "I have been. Your court ladies have very sharp tongues." "And how did you fare?" "I think I held my own, though I may have made some enemies." Adrian's mouth curved in what might have been approval. "Good. Anyone who would attack you for your background wasn't going to be a friend anyway. Better to know where you stand from the beginning." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and careful conversations. Alara noticed that word of her exchange in the retiring room had spread. Some courtiers now looked at her with new wariness, as if reassessing a dog they had thought was tame. When the evening finally ended and they were alone in her chambers, Alara sank into a chair, feeling completely drained. "I'm not sure I'm built for this," she admitted. "All that smiling and pretending, all those careful words that mean the opposite of what they say. In the poor district, if someone didn't like you, they said so. If they wanted to fight, they fought. This, dancing around with pretty insults, feels more exhausting than anything I did on the streets." Adrian poured himself a glass of wine from the decanter on her side table. "The difference is that on the streets, the worst they could do was hurt your body. Here, they're trying to destroy your spirit. And you live with this every day?" "I was born to it. I learned the rules before I learned to walk properly. But you're right. It is exhausting. It's why I spend so much time riding through the city instead of attending court functions." Alara studied his face, seeing something there she hadn't noticed before. "You're as much a prisoner here as I am, aren't you? Just a different kind of prison." "Perhaps. Though I've never thought of it that way before. What made you think of marrying someone like me?" "Really? Not the political reasons you've given me, but the personal ones." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass as if the answer might be found in its depths. "Loneliness, maybe. I've been surrounded by people my entire life, but most of them see a crown instead of a person. They tell me what they think I want to hear, agree with opinions I haven't even formed yet, laugh at jokes that aren't funny because I'm the one telling them." He looked up at her, and for the first time since she had known him, his careful control slipped enough to show the man underneath. "When I watched you in the poor district, I saw someone who was genuinely herself, who responded to what was actually happening instead of what protocol demanded, someone who made decisions based on what was right instead of what was expected. I've been looking for that kind of authenticity my entire life. And now that you've found it, Now that you see what it looks like when someone like me tries to function in your world, now I'm more convinced than ever that this world needs changing, and that you might be exactly the person to help me change it." His words carried a weight that made her chest tight. What if I can't? What if they break me down, make me into just another court lady who smiles and says pretty things that mean nothing? Then I'll have lost the only real thing I've ever found in this place. Adrian set down his wineglass and moved closer to her chair. But I don't think that will happen. You've survived worse than Lady Vivian and her friends. You've faced real cruelty and come through it with your compassion intact. A few sharp-tongued nobles aren't going to destroy what exile and poverty couldn't touch. You sound very certain. I am. Do you know why? Tell me. Because tonight, when they attacked you, you didn't curl up and hide. You didn't apologize for existing or try to make yourself smaller. You stood your ground and made them back down. That's not the behavior of someone who breaks easily. Alara felt something uncurl in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. So what happens now? Do I keep fighting them every time they try to put me in my place? You keep being yourself. Let them exhaust themselves trying to change you. Eventually, they'll either accept that you're not going anywhere, or they'll reveal themselves as the small, cruel people they really are. Either way, you win. And what about us? This partnership we're building, how does it survive in a place like this? Adrian was quiet for a moment, then reached out to take her hand. It was the first time he had touched her without ceremony requiring it, and his fingers were warm against her cold ones. "I think," he said slowly, "that we learn to be a safe place for each other, a refuge where we can drop the masks and remember who we really are underneath all the performance." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was something perhaps more valuable, a promise of understanding, of alliance, of two people agreeing to face a hostile world together. "I can do that," Alara said. "Be your refuge, I mean, if you can be mine." "Deal," Adrian said, and when he smiled, it was the first completely genuine expression she had seen from him since the day he proposed. Outside her windows, the court continued its endless dance of power and politics. But inside her chambers, two people who had been alone their entire lives had found something worth protecting. Each other. Adrian maintained careful distance even as their wedding approached, their interactions formal as diplomatic negotiations. He escorted her to required functions with perfect courtesy but no warmth, his arm offering support while his eyes remained distant as winter sky. Alara began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake, trading the honest hatred of the streets for the cold indifference of a man who saw her as duty rather than desire. During their supervised visits, conversation felt stilted, each searching for safe topics that revealed nothing of their inner thoughts. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't decipher, but when their eyes met, he looked away like a man caught in some transgression. His touch, when protocol demanded it, carried no tenderness, just the careful handling of something fragile that might break if held too tight. She wondered what she expected from this arrangement, what foolish part of her hoped for something beyond transaction. The wedding preparations continued around them like a performance they were both compelled to attend but not participate in. Yet sometimes, in unguarded moments, she glimpsed something deeper in his gaze. Not love, perhaps, but something that might grow into understanding if given time and tending. She held on to these glimpses like candle flames in darkness, hoping they might eventually light their way to something real. Olara's history became court currency as nobles dug through her family's secrets like carrion birds. The truth of her banishment emerged in fragments: her refusal to marry the cruel lord her father chose, her defense of abused servants, her unwomanly opinions about justice and mercy. What her family called rebellion, others might call integrity, but the court twisted each detail to paint her as willful and dangerous. She learned that Adrian knew it all, had known from the beginning, yet his face revealed nothing when confronted with the gossip. "Truth is rarely as simple as reputation suggests," he said cryptically when she asked if the stories changed his opinion of her. Meanwhile, her stepmother arrived for the wedding festivities, her smile sharp as winter ice and twice as cold. She moved through court functions, scattering carefully chosen words designed to undermine Alara's position before it was fully established. "Such a pity about the family curse," she murmured to anyone who'd listen. "The women never seem to thrive in marriage." Alara watched her work with grudging admiration for her stepmother's skill at social warfare, even as fury burned in her chest. The past refused to stay buried, and she realized that marrying a prince wouldn't shield her from judgment. It would only make her a more visible target for those who profit from others' downfall. The cathedral filled with more spectacle than joy as nobles gathered to witness the crown prince marry the girl nobody wanted. Alara walked the aisle alone. Her father refused to attend, claiming illness rather than association with her disgrace. The dress Adrian commissioned transformed her into something ethereal, but she felt like an actress playing a role she didn't understand. His face, waiting at the altar, revealed nothing of his thoughts as she approached through air thick with whispered judgment and barely concealed contempt. The ceremony unfolded with ceremonial precision, their vows exchanged like contracts rather than promises of love. When Adrian lifted her veil for the traditional kiss, his eyes met hers for one breathless moment, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or simple acknowledgement of the leap they were taking together into unknown territory. His lips touched hers briefly, formally, but his hand trembled almost imperceptibly against her cheek. The crowd cheered because protocol demanded it, but the sound carried no warmth. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Alara noticed Adrian's jaw set with determination, his arm steady against her waist like an anchor in stormy seas. Whatever this marriage became, she realized, it would be built on something more solid than affection, mutual respect for the courage it takes to stand together against a world determined to see them fail. Their wedding chambers had been prepared with all the luxury befitting royalty. Rose petals scattered across silk sheets in romantic mockery of what everyone expected to unfold. Adrian entered after giving her time to change, his own formal attire replaced by simple nightclothes that somehow made him seem more human and less like the distant prince. They stood facing each other across the ornate room like strangers suddenly thrust into intimacy neither had chosen. "This doesn't have to be anything more than appearance," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual authority. "The court expects us to share chambers, but I won't force unwelcome attention." Relief and something else, disappointment, warred in Alara's chest. She expected many things from this night, but his consideration wasn't among them. They talked instead, awkward at first, then with growing ease as wine-loosened tongues kept careful all day. He told her about the loneliness of crowns and duty. She shared stories of her months among the forgotten. For the first time, they saw each other as people rather than roles. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they slept on opposite sides of the vast bed, a careful distance maintained even in unconsciousness. Yet something had shifted in that darkened room, a foundation laid not of passion, but of something potentially stronger, the beginning of genuine understanding between two souls learning to trust despite every reason for caution. Court life as a married woman brought new challenges as Alara navigated the treacherous waters of royal protocol. Lady-in-waiting assignments became passive-aggressive battles as established courtiers tested her authority and found it wanting. She was given responsibilities without guidance, set up to fail in ways both subtle and cruel. Adrian, buried in matters of state, seemed oblivious to the daily humiliations she endured. Their breakfast conversations remained polite and distant. Their evening meals were often interrupted by urgent matters requiring his attention. She felt invisible in her own marriage, a decorative addition to his life that required no real integration. Yet, slowly, she began to carve out her own space within the rigid court structure. She remembered lessons learned on the streets about reading people, about finding allies in unexpected places. The younger servants responded to kindness, the older ones respected quiet competence. She established routines that gave her days structure and purpose, refusing to become the ornamental wife everyone expected. When Adrian's schedule permitted conversation, she found him surprisingly willing to listen to her observations about court dynamics and social undercurrents. He may not love her, but he was beginning to value her insights. It wasn't the marriage she once dreamed of, but perhaps it was the foundation upon which something genuine might eventually be built. A scandal erupted when several noble families petitioned to have the marriage annulled, claiming Alara's tainted blood made her unfit for royal succession. The challenge came disguised as concern for the realm's stability, but everyone recognized it as a power play by those who preferred Adrian remain unwed and malleable. Court factions crystallized around the issue, with some supporting the prince's right to choose, while others whispered about bloodlines and proper breeding. Alara watched the political maneuvering with growing understanding of the forces arrayed against her. Adrian's response surprised everyone. Instead of diplomatic deflection, he addressed the court with cold fury barely held in check. "I will not have my wife's worth debated like commodity prices," he declared, his voice carrying the kind of authority that makes men remember why they kneel to crowns. The challenge failed, but the attempt left scars. Alara realized she wasn't just fighting for acceptance. She was fighting for survival in a world where political marriages could be dissolved as easily as they're made. More importantly, she saw something in Adrian's defense of her that wasn't there before, not duty or obligation, but genuine protective anger. Perhaps their marriage meant more to him than simple convenience. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, opening possibilities she wasn't sure she was brave enough to explore. Adrian began showing Alara small kindnesses that felt enormous after months of careful distance. He remembered her preference for tea over wine, ensured her favorite flowers appeared in their shared chambers, included her in discussions about policies affecting the poor. These gestures came without fanfare or explanation, making them feel like gifts rather than obligations. When she mentioned missing the sunrise from her childhood window, he arranged for their breakfast to be served in the eastern tower, where dawnlight flooded through tall windows. When court functions overwhelmed her with their cruelty, he appeared at her elbow with excuses to draw her away from hostile conversations. His presence became a shield she could rely on without having to ask for protection. She began to see past his princely mask to the man beneath, someone as trapped by duty as she once was by family expectations, someone who understood the weight of others' judgments. Their evening conversations grew longer, ranging beyond court gossip to philosophy, dreams, fears they'd never voiced aloud. He spoke of the loneliness of command. She shared her terror of becoming someone she didn't recognize. These midnight talks felt like conspiracies between allies, learning to trust each other with truths too dangerous for daylight. Love may not yet live between them, but something deeper was taking root, the kind of understanding that makes two people willing to face the world together. Lord Edmund arrived at court with Alara's younger sister Lydia in tow, suddenly eager to claim kinship with the crown princess. His transformation from rejecting father to proud patriarch would be laughable if it weren't so transparently calculating. Lydia, barely 16 and beautiful in the way Alara once was, became the tool in their father's latest scheme to regain royal favor. She was presented as everything Alara failed to be, obedient, pure, unspoiled by hardship or scandal. The court, ever eager for fresh gossip, whispered comparisons between the sisters with cruel precision. Adrian observed these family dynamics with the same careful attention he gave diplomatic negotiations, saying little but missing nothing. When Lord Edmund suggested that perhaps the crown prince might be interested in a more suitable Ashworth daughter as a mistress, since his marriage to Alara could not be changed, the silence in the throne room became deadly. Adrian's response cut through pretense like a sword through silk. "I am quite satisfied with the Ashworth daughter I chose." The words carried warning that even Lord Edmund couldn't mistake. Yet damage had been done. Court tongues wagged about the better sister, and Alara watched Lydia's wide-eyed innocence with a mixture of protective love and bitter recognition of what she herself once was before the world taught her harder lessons. Lydia's presence at court became a constant reminder of everything Alara had lost and failed to be. Whether by design or nature, the younger sister excelled where Alara struggled. Her musical performances enchanted audiences, her dancing drew admiring crowds, her gentle manner made even critics warm to her charm. She moved through court functions like a flower in sunlight, while Alara felt like a weed growing in shadows. The comparisons were inevitable and cruel. Such a pity the prince married the wrong sister. Imagine if he'd waited for the beauty of the family. Blood will tell, and this one clearly got the better portion. Alara watched Adrian during these performances, searching for signs that he regretted his choice, that he saw what he might have had instead. His face revealed nothing, but she caught him studying Lydia with the same analytical gaze he turned on all court intrigues. When Lydia sought her out for sisterly confidences, speaking of marriage prospects and court gossip with breathless enthusiasm, Alara felt ancient beside this creature who hadn't yet learned that beauty fades and cruelty endures. Yet something in Lydia's eyes suggested she understood more than she let on, that perhaps her innocence was as much performance as protection. The sisters circled each other like dancers in a ballet whose steps they both knew, but whose ending remained unwritten. The turning point came at a grand court festival where both sisters were expected to perform. Lydia sang with the voice of angels, while nobles sighed with appreciation for what they called true Ashworth blood. When Alara's turn came, she chose not to compete on her sister's ground, but to speak instead about the forgotten people beyond the castle walls, painting word pictures of their struggles and dignity that left the audience uncomfortably silent. It wasn't entertainment, but truth-telling, and it made the courtiers shift in their silk-cushioned seats. Adrian watched from the royal dais, his expression unreadable as always. Later, when nobles clustered around Lydia like moths drawn to flame, praising her performance and beauty, someone made the inevitable suggestion, surely the prince would welcome such accomplished company. The words hung in the perfumed air like a challenge to everything Alara had tried to build. Then Adrian rose from his throne, crossing the room with deliberate steps to where Alara stood alone by the windows. In front of the entire court, he took her hand and led her to the center of the room. "I chose my wife," he said clearly, "not for her ability to entertain, but for her capacity to lead. Entertainment fades, character endures." The words rang through the sudden silence like bells, and Alara felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, perhaps, but the recognition that she had been truly chosen, not once but again, in the face of obvious alternatives. A terrible storm trapped the court inside the castle for days, and the forced intimacy stripped away many of the polite pretenses that normally governed royal interactions. When word came that flooding had devastated the lower districts, where Alara's former friends still struggled to survive, she demanded permission to organize relief efforts. The request sparked fierce debate among advisors who saw it as inappropriate for a princess to involve herself so directly with society's cast-offs. Adrian surprised everyone by not only granting permission, but joining her efforts personally. They worked side by side, distributing food and blankets, tending injuries, offering comfort to those who'd lost everything to the rising waters. In the chaos of genuine crisis, the careful distance between them dissolved into practical partnership. She saw him stripped of royal ceremony, mud-stained and exhausted, carrying a fever-sick child to safety without thought for his dignity. He saw her organizing rescue efforts with the quiet competence she learned surviving on the streets, never flinching from others' pain or need. When they finally collapsed in their chambers after 3 days of relentless work, something fundamental had changed between them. They'd seen each other tested by crisis and proven worthy of respect. The conversations that followed flowed more easily, barriers lowered by shared purpose and mutual admiration for what they'd accomplished together. In the aftermath of the storm, Alara and Adrian found themselves truly talking for the first time, not as prince and reluctant bride, but as partners who'd discovered they work well together. He told her about the weight of inheriting a kingdom where suffering exists alongside splendor, where every decision affects lives he'll never meet. She shared her insights about leadership learned not in throne rooms, but in the streets where authority must be earned through service rather than birth. Their evening conversations became the day's highlight, discussions ranging from philosophy to practical governance, from personal fears to shared dreams of what their kingdom might become. Adrian began seeking her counsel on matters of state, finding her perspective valuable in ways that have nothing to do with gender or birthright. She discovered that behind his carefully controlled exterior lives a man who cares deeply about justice, but struggles with the limitations of power. When he speaks of loneliness, she understands. When she mentions her fear of never being enough, he nods with recognition. They're building something unprecedented, a royal partnership based on mutual respect and complementary strengths rather than obligation or passion. Love may still be distant, but something deeper is growing. The kind of understanding that makes two people willing to stand together against whatever storms may come. A crisis erupted when several noble houses, emboldened by growing unrest among the common people, attempted what amounts to a bloodless coup against Adrian's rule. They claimed his marriage to a tainted woman had weakened his authority and rendered him unfit for the crown. The challenge came disguised as concern for the realm's stability, but everyone recognized it as naked ambition. Alara found herself at the center of the storm, blamed for bringing discord to the kingdom through her very existence. Some advisors counseled Adrian to distance himself from his controversial wife to preserve his throne. Others suggested more drastic solutions. Instead, Adrian made a choice that surprised everyone. He stood before the assembled nobles with Alara beside him, their hands clasped in deliberate unity. His speech resonated through the throne room. A crown that can be preserved only through cruelty is not worth keeping. A kingdom that rejects mercy has forgotten what makes it worth ruling. He challenged the coup leaders directly, offering single combat to any who questioned his fitness to rule. When none stepped forward, their cause crumbled like castles built on sand. But the real victory came when several younger nobles, inspired by the royal couple's example, began speaking out against the established order's casual cruelties. Change was coming to the kingdom, slow but inevitable, and it was being led by a prince and his unwanted bride who discovered their individual strengths multiply when joined together. In the quiet months following their triumph over those who would have seen them fail, Alara and Adrian's partnership deepened into something neither expected when they first stood together at the altar. Love arrived not with fanfare, but like dawn breaking, so gradual they barely noticed until suddenly they were standing in full light. She realized she looked forward to his return from council meetings. He found himself seeking her opinion, not because protocol demanded it, but because her thoughts mattered to him. Their shared chambers became a sanctuary where masks could be dropped and vulnerabilities shared without fear of judgment. When she fell ill with fever, his vigil at her bedside revealed depths of caring that surprised them both. When pressure from the crown weighed heavily on his shoulders, her presence became the peace he needed to carry on. They began touching without protocol's prompting, his hand finding hers during difficult conversations, her fingers brushing his cheek when exhaustion lined his face. Their first real kiss came not from passion, but from gratitude, a gentle acknowledgement of what they'd built together. Neither spoke of love directly. The word felt too fragile for what's growing between them, something stronger than romance, but more tender than mere partnership. They were becoming what neither dared hope for, two people who'd chosen each other not once, but every day, building something that would last beyond crowns and kingdoms. Years had passed, and the kingdom had changed under Adrian and Alara's joint rule. The programs she championed for the forgotten had become models for other realms. His policies blending justice with mercy had brought unprecedented peace. Their marriage, once scandalous, now stood as proof that love built on respect endures longer than unions forged by convenience or passion. She'd never been more beautiful than she was now, confidence and purpose having replaced the haunted uncertainty of her exile. He'd never been more truly royal than when he stood beside her, their complementary strengths making them formidable partners in both governance and life. The court that once whispered about the unwanted bride now sought her counsel and coveted her favor. Yet their greatest victory was private, the quiet moments at day's end when they sat by their fire, speaking of dreams yet to be fulfilled, challenges yet to be faced, a future they'd meet together. When their first child quickened in her womb, the symbol of their union was no longer political, but deeply personal, proof that what began as necessity had become the deepest kind of choice. She looked back sometimes at the girl who was cast out into storm and darkness, and she saw now that those terrible months weren't punishment, but preparation. The manor that rejected her could never have given her what she'd found, not just a throne beside a good man, but a home built on the understanding that true nobility lies not in blood or birth, but in how we choose to love when loving requires courage. The story that began with rejection ended with belonging, not the desperate clinging of the lost, but the quiet certainty of souls that have found their proper place in the world.